So this session of the conference is entitled Faith and Pluralism. I'm Rick Plantinga, Professor of Religion at Calvin College. Let me briefly introduce our presenters. They'll each take 20 minutes. After the session is over, we'll have about 25 minutes for discussion. Be really nice if there are some students here who would like to ask a question. So if you're a student here, please consider asking a question. Our first presenter is Kristen Dede Johnson, who holds a PhD in theology from St. Andrews University in Scotland. Before joining the faculty of Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan, Professor Johnson was the founding director of the Studies in Ministry minor and the Center for Ministry Studies at Hope College. Professor Johnson's teaching and scholarship engage areas of theology, discipleship and formation, justice, culture, and political theory. She recently co-authored the award-winning Justice Calling, Where Passion Meets Perseverance, published by Brazos Press. Other publications include Theology, Political Theory, and Pluralism, Beyond Tolerance and Difference, published by Cambridge University Press. Our second presenter is Carrie Cross Riddle, who holds degrees from Harding University in Searcy, Arkansas, the University of Maryland, and the University of Notre Dame, where she received a PhD in Peace Studies and Political Science. Professor Riddle teaches in the Political Science Department at Calvin College. Her book manuscript, Critical Feminist Just Peace, examines women's peace-building movements in the context of intra- and inter-ethnic conflict in Manipur, India. Professor Riddle's love for South Asia extends to cooking elaborate Indian and Nepali feasts, which we unfortunately will not be sampling at today's luncheon. She and her husband Jonathan, a history professor at Wheaton College, divide their time between Easttown in Grand Rapids and Wheaton, Illinois. Our third presenter, Kevin Dundalk, holds degrees from Calvin College, the University of Georgia, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, from which institution he received a PhD in political science. He has taught at Grand Valley State University and is currently a faculty member in the Department of Political Science at Calvin College. He's also the executive director of the Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics, and holder of the Paul B. Henry Chair in Political Science. Professor Dundalk is the author of several scholarly articles and co-author of a variety of volumes, including Religion and Politics in America. With that, I welcome our first presenter, Professor Kristen Dede Johnson.
Well, as I begin, I hope you'll allow me to indulge in a little bit of personal reflection. Last year, about a year ago, I was invited to contribute to a panel. About a year ago, I was invited to contribute to a book in which a number of Christians were asked to reflect on how they engage pluralism. What does it look like to engage as Christians with those who have very different convictions or ways of life, and how do we go about that? And the difference was that they wanted us to reflect on that in light of our own stories. Prior to that point, most of my writings thinking about that had been academic. So I've been in the season of reflecting on how I came to care about these issues, starting as a 20-something heading into DC for my first experience on Capitol Hill. I grew up just outside the city, so I didn't expect the experience inside the city to be so different. But not too long into my time there, I realized there was this sort of very different experience, kind of this sense of embattlement you would hear in the air, sort of a call to action, a call to arms, that didn't match my previous studies or readings or experiences. So I returned to the University of Virginia and found James Davison Hunter, who had just written a book called Culture Wars that helped me make sense of this conflict that I was seeing and sort of that sort of warrior call to arms mentality. And that put me on a journey of reflecting on what was going on within American politics, and deeper than that, what was the nature of the American political experiment, and was it viable? So I was really gripped by those questions and decided to go on to graduate school, really wanting to ask, is this whole experiment working? Do we have the resources we need, philosophically to carry it forward? And do we have the resources we need to shape citizens to carry it forward? In fact, I applied for a Rhodes Scholarship, and I remember really trying to convince them of the gravity of these questions. And I think they didn't know quite how to fit me because I was a confessional Christian, but I wasn't asking about sort of the demise of morality in general. I really was concerned about the whole experiment. I did not convince them. They did not give me the scholarship. So I went on to graduate school in theology, and that experience actually really shifted my questions. I went over concerned about the state of the American political entity and if it had the resources it needed to move forward. But I began to think perhaps my calling was more to imagine what it looks like for Christians to be faithful within the contemporary political conditions. So rather than trying to sort of think of a solution to the theoretical problems we were facing, what does it look like to think about Christian faithfulness within these conditions of pluralism and contemporary liberalism? And that's what I've spent the last few years exploring in different ways. And I now teach at a seminary where I'm really trying to wrestle with formation. What does it take to form pastors and churches to live faithfully in a complicated cultural and political time? So the question, as I picked up Deneen's book, Has Liberalism Failed Us?, really took me back to my early 20s and all these questions I had about, is this whole experiment sustainable? And maybe it comes from working for a couple years on a book called The Death of Character with James Hunter, where I was supposed to be young and idealistic in my 20s, I was a little bit more pessimistic about the hope for us. But I do resonate with a lot of the questions he raises. What is the formative impact of liberalism on us today? So I want to explore how and whether any of us or any religious faith can withstand the formative power of this operating system. What impact is it having on our faith communities, and what does that mean for those of us who are trying to live faithfully or encourage faithfulness? So I'm not going to be looking at what political or economic theory could save us or change things, or questions of public reason or the place for Christian voices in the public realm, which are all very valid and important questions when it comes to the intersection of liberalism and pluralism. But really that formation question. Maybe it's a bit like what Jamie Smith's encouraging in Awaiting the King, the pastor as political theologian, that we need to be aware of and recognizing the rites and rituals, the beliefs of our current political moment, and be able to explore them through biblical and theological lenses. So some of the impacts of pluralism, I'll just name a couple. The question of how do we live together in conditions of deep difference? And I'm thinking more of practical outcomes. What Hunter's exploring in Death of Character is what this looks like specifically in our schools and as we think about moral education. What has been the impact? Now, there is a philosophical intent in some of this, but some of it is practical. When you have a lot of different people with a lot of different beliefs coexisting, what can you appeal to in your collective moral reasoning? So a close look at character education and values education at the time of the study revealed that really the self was the main thing that most people were left appealing to, because there wasn't a greater pool of shared history tradition. So the rise of appeals to the self, which have, again, a lot of philosophical roots too, but on some level have sort of this practical outcome. And also, Berger's famous dissolution of the markers of certainty, that there is an impact just by living with a lot of different people on how we hold our beliefs, that it's harder to hold them with the same level of certainty, which can engender a healthy humility, but can also make it simply hard to believe and to inhabit your own faith tradition. Another piece we want to wrestle with is what last night we heard called the transmuting pot, is maybe more helpful than the melting pot. The question of how much liberalism really changes the traditions in its midst. Now, I can't speak for all of liberalism, but in my close look at the work of John Rawls, it's certainly clear that his vision of how to navigate political differences within a political system do depend on people's, what he calls, comprehensive doctrines, the beliefs that we would want to be shaping our lives comprehensively. So his theory depends on most people's comprehensive doctrines not actually being comprehensive. And because they're not fully worked out or fully shaping people's lives, he says political principles can win their primary allegiance. So if a conflict does emerge, quote, they may very well adjust or revise those doctrines rather than reject the political principles. And these adjustments or revisions take place slowly over time, he says, as the political conception shapes comprehensive views to cohere with it. Right, so he's acknowledging that while he wants to have space for comprehensive doctrines, to some degree it only works if the comprehensive doctrines aren't really comprehensive and if they sort of slowly get shaped, or we could say transmuted over time to fit within a liberal political framework. Or as J. Judd Owen writes of Rawlsian liberalism, liberalism depends on religion being substantively transformed. So one of the questions we want to ask is, what does that mean for our faith communities? How much have they been shaped or transformed? So one piece I look at is, of course, the famous public-private divide that is a part of liberal thought, and how religion within our current political theories is relegated to this private sphere, and Christianity itself kind of in many ways went along with that. And people like William Cavanaugh and Pierre Manent have asked, is that narrative that we've inherited that religion had to become private to avoid the bloodshed of the religious wars, is that really a true narrative? Or is it the case that actually it was an intentional move away from the power of the church into increased power for the state, and that liberalism provided the intellectual resources to undergird that move? Whatever the actual history, the reality is that we do have an operating system in which Christianity is considered private, and that has an impact on our traditions. And related to that is the space given to religious traditions is that of a voluntary association. So the same category that you would put sporting leagues or bowling leagues or PTAs, PTOs, Christian and other faith traditions fit into that space. And one of the questions I've asked in my writing is, what impact does that have? Because we like to think, I assume most of us in this space like to think that Christianity is a little bit more identity shaping and life shaping than a sporting league or a bowling league. So what is the formative power of that being the space allocated to us? And again, I don't want to view Christians as helpless victims. I mean, we have also provided resources to undergird some of these conceptual changes, but they have had an impact. So what does it mean as we wrestle with the call upon us to be faithful disciples within a voluntary association model? Can that work? In other words, can the church ever be as formative as we really need it to be? Or is there something within that framework that so pushes it to be sort of this private system of beliefs in this allocated space that we're never going to be able to have the formation we need to live out the faith as it's intended to be? Ken Myers has talked about this as, he says, most pastors are simply chaplains to the American way of life. And most Christian families are unwilling to do what it takes to really live differently. Andy Crouch tells a story of attending a multi-course, fabulous feast. And there was a faithful Jewish man practicing keeping his kosher laws. And round after round, he sent the food away because it was more important to him to be faithful than to share in that meal. And what does it look like for Christians to be formed that deeply, where whatever the pressures, the moments, the cultural pressures, we have the resources we need to make those faithful decisions? Or are the formative forces coming towards us so great that it's going to be very difficult to ever form disciples who can withstand those pressures? In his work, Deneen identifies a wide range of things that have been impacted. Conceptions of the self, what we desire, the liberal arts and the purposes of education, how we understand and inhabit time and place, the rise of a new aristocracy, and the new inequities that accompany that, our use of technology, our emphasis on consumption. So how does this operating system sort of really play out in this cultural moment? Are Christians really living any differently? Have we been able to withstand these formative liturgies? What Jamie Smith calls the Godfather problem. Or what came up in the earlier panel, how much have markets changed the church? How much agency does the church have to resist? What might that formation look like? So I just want to offer a couple examples. One is this sort of impact of economic thinking. We've heard about the rise of and creation of suburbs. And this whole movement that others like Richard Reeves have talked about, this rise of a new aristocracy, dream hoarding, that there's a whole class of people who have inherited a lot of privilege and are hoarding that, and not always knowing that they're hoarding it, that maybe the real challenge isn't just the 99.9%, but the people between 90 and 99 who don't even realize that the ways that they're living are passing on what they've achieved only to their children, what Robert Putnam might call focusing on our kids only, my kids, not our kids. Or the glass floor, right? We used to hear a lot about the glass ceiling, but the image that is being used now is the glass floor, that those of us who have attained certain levels are keeping that for ourselves. And not always intentionally, but because that's what we've been shaped to think it means to be a good parent, is to pass that on to our children. And we don't even realize the impact it's having on others. I think this is related to this sort of conceptual categories that we've been handed down, things like how we use our time. The sense that everything needs to be done efficiently. So we seek to attend to things like matters of housekeeping in the most efficient manner possible, seeking to do the most amount of work in least possible amount of time. David Masco McCarthy writes about this. Housework is not productive in the dominant economy. Because value is determined by the market, housekeeping becomes nearly meaningless. Or Wendell Berry, the triumph of the market economy is the fall of community. All the things that only community life can engender and protect, the care of the old, the care and education of children, family life, neighborly work. So I'm using this, I guess I'm trying to make an ethnographic move to look at sort of on the ground. We can think theoretically about sort of what's the impact, but if we're looking at sort of on the ground, the impact of some of this operating system on how we imagine our time and the usefulness of our time, and making this connection to how we shape our lives and our homes, which is linked to kind of a public-private divide that we've accepted now that the home is part of the private realm, and contributing to the public good, you have to leave the home and enter the outside world, the working world. And the suburban home encapsulates this, according to McCarthy. A house in the suburbs, self-sufficient, inhabited only by people you've picked, lots of yards around you. Deneen talks about the move from the patio, porch to the patio. You're separated, isolated from demands any neighbors might make. And if you need help, you pay for it, right? That there's not an interdependentness, so that the architecture implies a whole way of inhabiting the world that really Christians should reject as problematic, because we were created from the beginning to be interdependent, and we were called to be a family of God, and the covenant story unfolds that over time. And in Christ, we have become and are invited into God's covenant people and are called to live out this communal, interdependent life. And that there are ways we have sort of adopted, even in the architecture we move into and the ways we structure our lives within that architecture, to a lot of ways of living and being that are formative, that are really shaping us. So McCarthy says, what if rather than paying for the help we need, but otherwise operating independently, we have more of an open household marked by interdependence, porous boundaries, wider networks of exchange and cooperation? So what would it take to form Christians who can receive and live out that vision? One minute? Okay, I have another example, but I'll skip that one. If we want to come back to it, I was going to look at the flag controversy of the past year and sort of what, again, a window into formation, and whether, when we look on the ground, how much are real live Christians being shaped by certain narratives and inherited civil religious categories without realizing it. So I want to be hopeful, and I know J.B. Smith, Matthew Kamink, and others have really helped us see the power of worship and liturgy to form us. They have a lot of concessions as well about when that doesn't work, and Lauren Winner has a new book with Yale University Press on ways practices go awry, that maybe we need to problematize the weight we put onto these practices. So I'm trying to connect parts of my intellectual journey on the problem. Pluralism is a part of our reality, and we want to be able to engage it with generosity and humility, but also acknowledge how formative these forces are that are shaping us to live in different ways. And where are we really seeing Christians living differently? Can we learn from those places if they're out there? What might it really take to be able to inhabit our faith, not simply as a private voluntary association, but as a really embodied, shaping way of life? And what is that going to take? So those are some of the questions I've been asking. Thank you.
Well, I first want to thank Professor Deneen for joining us here at Calvin College. We were at Notre Dame together when I was a graduate student there, so it's really fun for me now that I am here at my new institution to get to welcome him. And thanks very much to my political science colleague, Micah Watson, for organizing this important and timely conference, and particularly for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I did want to say a brief word about myself as a scholar to help you understand where I'm coming from in my comments. I think I'm a little bit of a black sheep at this conference because I do not study the United States. I was trained in development studies, peace studies, and political science, and my most recent research was in northeastern India with women's peacebuilding groups. So my views on liberalism and pluralism are informed primarily by women's experiences in India and by bodies of political theory like feminist thought and post-colonial thought. So I'll be employing a perspective on liberalism from marginalized women in a global South setting. That's very different from Deneen's scholarship and his focus on the US context, but I think that the juxtaposition of our two very different sets of concerns will be instructive for our understanding of liberalism and pluralism. I'm going to try to accomplish 3 brief things in this presentation. So first, I want to highlight a couple of specific passages from Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed, particularly focusing on his approach to gender. Next, I want to present some of my findings from my study of women's interethnic and interreligious peacebuilding groups in northeastern India, which inform my response to those passages. And finally, I will briefly argue for my own critique of liberalism from feminist and pluralist perspectives. I actually share some of Deneen's questions and concerns about liberalism, but I approach it from a very different angle, and I would propose very different solutions. So first, how does Deneen approach gender in Why Liberalism Failed? I found a couple of passages in particular that I'd like to focus on, and both of these passages come from the concluding chapter of Why Liberalism Failed, in which Deneen considers how we might move towards a post-liberal age, essentially how we can see the weaknesses of liberalism for what they are and move past them into alternative political, economic, and social arrangements. Please bear with me while I quote a kind of lengthy paragraph here. So Deneen says, quote, "Part of moving toward a post-liberal age is recognizing that while liberalism's initial appeal was premised upon laudatory aspirations, its successes have often been based on a disfigurement of those aspirations. Its defenders often point to the liberation of women from conditions of inequality as a significant example of liberalism's success, and regard any critique of liberalism as a proposal to thrust women back into pre-liberal bondage. Yet the main practical achievement of this liberation of women has been to move many of them into the workforce of market capitalism, a condition that traditionalists like Wendell Berry, as well as Marxist political theorists like Nancy Fraser, regard as a highly dubious form of liberation. All but forgotten are arguments, such as those made in the early Republic, that liberty consists of independence from the arbitrariness not only of a king, but of an employer. Today, we consider the paramount sign of the liberation of women to be their growing emancipation from their biology, which frees them to serve a different, disembodied body, corporate America, and participate in an economic order that effectively obviates any actual political liberty." End quote. This passage is part of Deneen's diagnosis of the problems of liberalism when it comes to women's liberation. He's arguing liberalism has enabled a false liberation of women, one which actually puts them into the bondage of service to the market. A few pages later in this final chapter, Deneen offers some tentative solutions to this problem. He notes renewed religious interest in something like the Benedict option, as well as movements of homesteaders and radical homemakers who prize self-sufficiency. He says, quote, and this is a shorter quote this time, "A counter-anti-culture," basically people who are living in a post-liberal way, "also requires developing economic practices centered on household economics, namely economic habits that are developed to support the flourishing of households, but which in turn seek to transform the household into a small economy. Utility and ease must be rejected in preference to the practices of local knowledge and virtuosity. The ability to do and make things for oneself, to provision one's own household through the work of one's own and one's children's hands, should be prized above consumption and waste." End quote. And the second passage does not explicitly refer to women or to gendered concerns. However, Deneen's proposed solution, particularly with his references to homesteaders and homemakers, appears to uphold the traditional practice of tying women to the household. Now, he certainly might respond, he's envisioning a community in which men and women are working together to develop equitable economic practices. But centuries and even millennia of inequitable gendered practices gives me great pause here when I consider this solution. And I'll turn now to some examples from women peacebuilders in India to show you exactly why I have concerns about both Deneen's diagnosis of the problems with liberalism and his tentative solution as they relate to women. So I conducted research in the state of Manipur in northeastern India, which has been the site of low-intensity armed conflict for over 60 years. Manipur has essentially been occupied by the Indian Army and paramilitary forces under the status of martial law, and this has enabled the military forces to search, detain, rape, and even kill innocent civilians, basically with impunity. And against this violence and against the ongoing military occupation of Manipur, women's groups have formed to promote peace and justice in their society. And women adopt the role of peacebuilder primarily because it has been socially ascribed to them. This is partly because men tend to join armed liberation groups. Soldiers cannot simultaneously be peace builders, and partly because women who protest or who serve as go-betweens between armed groups are much less likely to be killed than men. So for better or for worse, women have really taken up this role of peace builder that has been socially ascribed to them. In order to do this peace-building work, which includes things like prayer meetings, vigils, protests, political lobbying, and initiating negotiations, women have to leave their homes. That is perhaps stating the obvious, but I can assure you that this is no small feat for many women in Manipur, who might face suspicion and censure from their communities when they try to go out into public spaces and make arguments about politics and society. Women from some ethnic groups are encouraged to go. Basically, it's a part of their group's cultural heritage for women to take up this admirable role of peace builder. Women from other ethnic groups are strongly discouraged from going. It's part of their group's heritage to limit women's activity in the public sphere. This fact of difference across women's experiences already raises a question for me with regard to Deneen's arguments about women and liberalism. Which women is he talking about who, according to proponents of liberalism, have liberated themselves from their biology in order to join the market? If you talk to women in the United States in the 1960s, when Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique was published, you would learn that some middle-class white women wanted to be liberated from their homes in order to do something that was more meaningful to them than housework. If you talk to African-American women at the time, many of whom would unfortunately be coming from the lower class because of systemic connections between race and class in this country, they might argue that they would really appreciate being liberated from their 3 low-paying jobs that made them unable to raise their own kids, even though they might really like to do that. So whenever I see arguments about women as an entire group, my first question is immediately, which women? It's such an incredibly diverse group. And I get the sense that Deneen's analysis of liberalism's problematic liberation of women in the US is only considering the experiences of white middle-class women. How would his analysis change if he was thinking about all women in the US, or even all women in the world? If we use Manipur as our point of reference, how do we critique liberalism's supposed penchant for liberating women from household chores in order to enter the alienating marketplace if they haven't yet been allowed by their ethnic group's traditions to enter the market in the first place? For those women peace builders in Manipur who do have access to the market, it is not a place of alienation and atomization, but rather an incredible source of empowerment and collective strength. The capital city of Manipur, Imphal, boasts the largest women-run market in all of Asia, known as Ima Market. Ima means mother in Manipuri. This is the language spoken by the largest ethnic group, the Meiteis. Ima Market is a covered open-air marketplace where hundreds of women gather to sell food that they've grown and handicrafts that they've made. And the income that they earn there often improves their position within their families. Traditionally, in rural India, men tend to be the breadwinners, but empirical studies have shown that women who bring an additional income to impoverished families tend to get treated much better by their husbands. Women who earn more income also tend to produce better health and education outcomes for their children. This is a far cry from women supposedly escaping their biology and, the conservative logic goes, their duties to their children by working outside of the home. In this setting, women's work outside of the home is better for their children, not worse, not to mention better for the women as human beings. And most importantly for peace building, Ima Market has long been a gathering place for political discussions, planning sessions, and protests. If something like the rape or murder of an innocent civilian happens, women peace builders go and meet at Ima Market to plan a course of action. The market thus aids in collective action, in the building of relationships, and in the empowerment of women who seek to act politically and to transform the power structures that make their society violent. Contrary to Deneen's claim that the economic order obviates political liberty, this particular market truly supports it. I've dealt primarily with Deneen's first passage so far regarding his diagnosis of the problem, and I now want to share one more example from Manipur to show why I'm troubled by the proposed solution. So some of my research in Manipur was done with groups of conflict widows, women who have lost husbands in the armed conflict. Once women are widows, whether their ethnic group's traditions really endorse employment outside the home or not, they often begin work as day laborers outside of economic necessity. This is back-breaking agricultural work for just a few dozen rupees per day. Basically, they're doing really difficult work for 8 to 10 hours a day in order to earn the amount of money that we regularly blow on a latte at Starbucks. These conflict widows often have to do this because they've received no education or skills training that enables them to get a better job. Moreover, they very often face discrimination and even abuse at the hands of their in-laws after their husbands have died. In Manipur, across ethnic groups, women traditionally move into their husband's household after they marry, leaving their own families behind. If their husbands get killed in the armed conflict, they're often left behind with family members who begin to resent them as an economic burden. Conflict widows very often face discrimination whether they work or whether they don't. Their in-laws will claim it's not proper for them to work, but they then somehow fail to provide the food and medicine that they might need. The conflict widow absolutely must go out and work as a day laborer in order to survive. And this is not meaningful work that she wants to do, but the household that she is a part of is failing to meet her basic needs, so she has no choice. Deneen paints a nice picture of a harmonious, hardworking, cooperative household, but there aren't that many people in the world who get to be a part of something like that, whether in India or in the United States. He offers this picture as if it were, or could be, the norm, but far more households are comprised of single moms or dads struggling to make ends meet, groups of young people living together because they're in so much debt that they can't rent an apartment on their own, much less buy their own house, or individuals who are trapped in abusive relationships and don't know how to leave. Going local, going down to the level of the household, can be a very good thing if it's a good household. But going local can also lend more power to petty abusers. So how can we counter potential abuse within households or on a slightly larger scale within local communities? Often through human rights frameworks. And recall that the conflict widows who are forced to work as day laborers earn just a few dozen rupees per day. One day's work in the field might be a difference between whether or not they get to eat the next day. And yet I attended meetings where women from peace-building NGOs were offering training sessions in women's rights and human rights. And I witnessed dozens of conflict widows giving up half a day's labor, which might mean they just gave up tomorrow's breakfast, in order to attend these educational sessions. They had the sense that something about human rights might have the capability to transform their lives. This was literal buy-in in terms of foregone income to the liberal system of rights that might possibly protect vulnerable women from abuse in their households. To close, I have my own critiques of relying on a highly individualistic, rights-based approach. I think that proponents of liberal peace building, a common framework in the field of peace studies for promoting good governance, human rights, and democracy in post-conflict areas, tend to overlook the ways in which liberalism's universalizing language and emphasis on humanity can downplay difference in a problematic way. By contrast, pluralism seeks to highlight difference and to explicitly create spaces in which marginalized voices can bring their concerns to the forefront of a political discussion. William Connolly suggests that doing pluralism well needs to include the willingness to recognize others and the ability to shift your understanding of your own identity. Basically, as you become aware of differences between yourself and others, you must not only validate other ways of being, but you must transform your understanding of yourself and your place in society in relation to that group. Liberalism might be able to help with that to some extent. Human rights language was an important tool for women who were trying to work together across ethnic and religious differences in peace building in Manipur. However, I did also see human rights language causing problems for peace building in Manipur because of its tendency to cover over difference. And in particular, I saw that the best funded and best organized peace building groups tended to use human rights language that was readily accessible to external donors and to UN observers. However, their peace building initiatives were often reaching only members of one ethnic group. So although they claimed solidarity on the basis of common humanity, their impact was still restricted by ethnicity. So I would argue that true solidarity across difference, basically a just use of a pluralistic framework, needs to be able to recognize, rather than elide, differences among groups of women or groups of humans. I think we can still use rights-based language while doing that, but we also need to be open to group-based differences and to ensure that we're acting in an equitable manner across groups. One way forward is to use multiculturalism, such as ideas put forward by Will Kimlicka. This really highlights the importance of belonging to a group, not only being an individual. And the Indian Constitution has long protected special rights for scheduled tribes and scheduled castes in recognition of the fact that people are not only individuals, but are a part of this group, which is meaningful for them. But in the case of abuse within a group, however, I think it's still important to recognize the dignity and the rights of individuals. And this has particularly been true for women, who unfortunately tend to suffer abuse at the household or group level much more regularly than men. And I also find Black feminist thought coming from scholars like Patricia Hill Collins and Audre Lorde to be very helpful for thinking about and highlighting difference in order to achieve justice, rather than covering up that difference. So in summary, my primary response to Deneen would be that liberalism, and particularly its reliance on individual rights, can be good or bad in Manipur, just as I would argue it can be good or bad in the United States. We need careful analysis of context, including differences between men's and women's experiences and differences among women's experiences, in order to truly understand how liberalism is affecting different groups. Our understanding of white middle-class experience needs to be tempered with other people's experiences with liberalism. Has liberalism failed in India? That remains to be seen, but there are a great many marginalized women who eagerly turn towards both the local market and the human rights framework as sources of liberation, not from their culture's understanding of their biology, but from men's preferences to discriminate against them. Thank you.
All right. Well, now for something a little bit different, but not completely so. I think we're going to have some cross currents to talk about later. I should say it's also going to be a little bit different from the kinds of work that I've done in the past. One of my books is titled The Challenge of Pluralism. It focuses on church-state relations in 6 democracies. And that's much more of a structural analysis. I've done some other work with Corwin Smith and others on how civil society cultivates certain kinds of dispositions, primarily through group life. But I'm going to focus in a different direction today. It's a set of questions that's always puzzled me, but I haven't studied directly. So in some ways, I'm going to be asking questions and giving no answers, and therefore copping out in this presentation. So I'll just start. So perhaps liberalism isn't long for this world, or ought not be, at least in its present iteration. Signs are all around us. The debilitating effects of identity-based polarization, the deconsolidation of established institutions, the populist movements careening throughout the West. Liberalism appears to be stumbling under its own ideological weight. If only imagining a reinvention or replacement of liberalism were as straightforward as witnessing its fragmentation. I agree with Patrick Deneen that there's little point in exercising a future-looking imagination as a form of reactionary nostalgia. There's no going back to a pre-liberal state. There is no fitting republic of virtue that we might make great again. Yet, we might still draw from reservoirs of pre-liberal thought and practice, and indeed learn from liberalism itself as we've inherited it, for good or ill. So I want to consider 2 of those inheritances today. The first, a response to liberalism, and the other, an effect of liberalism. The first is a normative framework, some of its proponents like to call principled pluralism. And this is familiar territory here at Calvin University. Oh, I just said that for you, Patrick. We've got to get used to that. July 2019. It has roots, this kind of pluralism has roots in a 19th century Reformed Protestant response to the 2 great ideological rivals of the day, liberalism and socialism. It's most closely associated, of course, with Abraham Kuyper, the Dutch anti-revolutionary, anti-French revolutionary, and hyperachiever of that era. But it's been developed by countless theorists and now has something of a global footprint, though that print is sometimes a little difficult to detect. This version of pluralism imagines a form of justice that is sensitive to patterns of association and belief that cultivate meaning and a sense of community, patterns that are often disrupted by the vagaries of liberalism. And here's the second inheritance. We're lonely. Liberal democracies across the world are experiencing persistent and metastasizing forms of social isolation and estrangement. And the kicker is that we arrange our lives perversely in ways that reinforce that experience. And this, of course, has been a theme in this conference and in Patrick's book. And so my question, does principled pluralism, an idea developed partly as a response to liberalism, have an answer to our social estrangement, a blight that's partly the result of liberalism? To be clear, in answering that question, I won't retrace principled pluralism as a matter of intellectual history. I won't explore how it develops alongside Catholic theology and resonates with that theology. I won't try to argue that it's an appealing normative vision, or even that it's the worst response to liberalism other than all of its alternatives. That's all been done much better than I could do, and in any case, it's beside my point. My question is targeted. Does principled pluralism have the capacity to address this growing social pattern of isolation, of loneliness? I'll admit that I'm rooting for pluralism. I'd like the answer to be yes. I see in pluralism a plausible and sometimes compelling response to the tension between solidarity and diversity that we've already heard discussed, that tension that sits at the core of liberal democracy in many ways. Pluralists insist that easing that tension is not an either-or proposition. We could learn to navigate our deep differences in public life without checking or dooming our convictions, without losing sight of who we are and where we come from. Could forge a principled and even confident pluralism, a way of living together that takes seriously both the coexistence of deep differences and fidelity to broader community. But unlike most accounts of pluralism, the question I raise here focuses on neither deep diversity nor solidarity. I ask instead about social dislocation. What's more, some provocative social science, and I'm going to commit some social science here, although I'm not going to have graphs and that sort of thing, but some provocative social science suggests that social dislocation is partly the result of how we experience the tension between diversity and solidarity. When we confront difference, especially in this political moment, we tend to know what we are not, but we rarely come away with the pluralist confidence in who we are. So let me back up and think about this with you a little bit. We can see the evidence of social dislocation in how people understand the institutions that might otherwise nurture purpose and community in their lives. Trust, not only in public institutions, but also in each other, interpersonal trust, is in an alarming decline across the liberal democracies of the West. Confidence in nearly every institution in civil society has eroded over the past 4 decades. One of the few institutions that has grown its support is the military, a telling fact, given its coercive capacity, both symbolic and real, to offer security in an era of disorientation and fear. As confidence wanes, especially in these institutions, people participate less. In the United States, the decline of religious affiliation and participation is the iceberg's tip of the broader problem of social disengagement. The problem takes different forms in other places, other countries, but the pattern is widespread and it's persistent. So what accounts for these trends? The range of possibilities in answering that question are well beyond the scope of this talk. But I want to focus on one cluster of arguments about social isolation and loneliness. And I should say that it's not a comforting area of inquiry, nor is the social science entirely clear in its message. But I think it's sufficiently compelling, especially in its implications for pluralism, that it deserves our attention. And the basic idea here is that exposure to diversity itself, and this is kind of interesting thinking about the way you were describing Connolly's argument, and lots of others. But the idea is that our exposure to diversity itself contributes to widespread social isolation and disaffection. The argument that exposure to diversity, ethnic, religious class, gender, and so on, explains polarization is not difficult to make. A great deal of social scientific work suggests, as the political scientist Robert Putnam puts it, that, quote, diversity and solidarity are negatively correlated. Exposure to diversity not only clearly exacerbates outgroup distrust, but also seems to shore up in-group unity, especially in the face of competition for limited resources. Social scientists often call this argument conflict theory, and while you'll hear echoes of Marx in the theory, the variety of accounts of this diversity versus solidarity dynamic go well beyond Marxian assumptions. The theory is often contrasted with so-called contact theory, which suggests the opposite. That is, that exposure to diversity works as a kind of healthy social osmosis, that it breaks down the high walls of in-group loyalties while building up out-group solidarity. Putnam notes that for all their differences, both the conflict and contact theories share the assumption that feelings toward in-groups and out-groups are inversely related. But this is an assumption that he rejects, that Putnam rejects, and for good reason, I think. In strictly analytical terms, I might have, if in strictly analytical terms, there is no necessary connection between my experience of in-groups and out-groups. I might have a powerfully negative emotional response to an out-group, a racist hate group, for example, to the point that I see it as an intolerable threat to my identity and my community. But my affective response to that group does not by itself initiate me into another. Racial minorities as a community, or organizations and movements such as the NAACP or Black Lives Matter. I'm not initiated into those groups, even though they counter the threat that I feel. I can reject a group and find social and political meaning in that rejection without offering my loyalty to its opposite. But Putnam does not stop with the suggestion that our experience of out and in groups might be unrelated. He also lays out a claim that provoked a great deal of discussion in both the social sciences and the attentive media. Exposure to diversity, and he explores in particular ethnic diversity, but you can make analogous arguments in other areas of identity. It says, exposure to diversity usually decreases trust in community cooperation across all groups. Diversity does not diminish trust in either one's outgroups, as conflict theory suggests, or in groups, which is the contention of contact theory, but both. In relatively diverse areas, people, as he puts it, hunker down and lose trust in everyone at higher rates than regions with greater ethnic homogeneity. After controlling for an impressive array of confounding factors, Putnam concludes that immigration and diversity more generally foster social isolation, not in-group bonding or out-group bridging. Now, there are some caveats. Putnam himself emphasizes that these findings are snapshots in time, and I would add place. He focuses primarily on the United States. These findings also don't tell us whether these dynamics change as people adapt to shifting patterns of diversity. He reminds us that identity is not deterministic. People do change how they understand themselves and their relationships. And societies change too. And it's also worth noting that subsequent research has clarified, extended, and sometimes challenged Putnam's thesis. Still, his work is a strong empirical and normative challenge, and quite a few studies complement its findings. In her book, I'm very fond of this book, Hearing the Other Side, the political scientist Diana Mutz has shown that people with significant cross-cutting or heterogeneous networks are less likely to participate in public life than those who interact mainly with others of like mind. The mechanism appears to be a kind of socio-political paralysis. Exposure to diverse perspectives introduces moral complexity that is not only difficult to navigate, but also sometimes a threat to one's own identity. And the most common response to such threats is to flee rather than to fight. Hence, exposure to diversity results in political withdrawal, and in some cases, self-isolation from groups in one's own network. Threads of evidence from other studies fill in the picture. Compared to residents in diverse regions, respondents in homogeneous areas report greater openness to discussing political ideas with opposed groups. Social media, as we talked about at this conference, has unleashed and reinforced alienated voices that are often hateful and sometimes teeter on the edge of violence. Ethnic diversity tends to diminish pro-social attitudes at the neighborhood level, and so on. My point is not to weigh all the evidence for the diversity as isolating thesis. I simply note the thesis because it raises questions about the principled pluralist vision that I'm trying to root for. What does or can pluralism say when difference does not come in the form of group loyalty, but rather the distrustful and disaffected, the alienated and isolated, the despairing and the lonely? I submit that principled pluralism and similar accounts lack easy answers to this question because their basic assumptions push social estrangement outside their boundaries. Pluralists usually talk about two primary loci of activity in public life. On the one side, there's a cluster of associations, which we often call today, of course, civil society. And this cluster of associations is composed of discrete groups or communities that have their own purposes, rituals and beliefs, and all of which, barring severely antisocial behavior, deserve to flourish in their own way without undue restriction. On the other side, there is the state, an institution of public justice with a key role as protector of the freedom of these groups in civil society and arbiter of disputes among them. Hence, the pluralist account emphasizes the structural dynamics of group loyalties. And those groups usually appear more or less coherent, and their members more or less are committed to a particular direction, a worldview, reinforced by shared practices and histories. We can imagine representatives of these groups around a table, the Muslim here, the evangelical there, the new atheist somewhere in the mix. But it's far more difficult to see where a person with weak group commitments would sit at the table. What do they even represent? What direction do they represent? The challenge of the alienated suggests the need for a more capacious vision of pluralism, perhaps a kind of pluralism that moves beyond structure and direction and toward dispositions. There's recent notable work, of course, that urges pluralists to take a better account of communally embedded practices. Consider Matt Kamick, we've already heard his name used. Kamick's argument in Christian hospitality and Muslim immigration in an age of fear. His focus is not only on the juridical structures that mark group boundaries and prescribe rules of engagement when Christians confront the flow of Muslim migration. He also insists that pluralism implies a set of virtues, hospitality, for example, that ought to orient a Christian's posture toward the other. And he argues that the church has a vital role in forming Christians for that virtue of hospitality. Like many others, however, Kamick argues on that familiar pluralist terrain, the contestation of group loyalists, Christians and Muslims committed to their faiths. I wonder how we might apply that same pluralist argument about practices that form virtues when we encounter those who are more alienated than committed. Perhaps that seems to ask too much of this kind of pluralism, which historically emerged out of deep-seated conflicts between and among religious and other groups. But pluralism is not fundamentally, or doesn't have to be fundamentally, about group contestation. It's about seeking a way of life that respects conviction while recognizing the reality of differences. Those differences are easily identifiable when they do come in group forms, but increasingly the disaffected embody those differences too, and they will continue to be with us even in a post-liberal future. Besides, the fact that alienation is related to the tension at the heart of pluralism, diversity contending with solidarity, suggests that pluralists ought to have something to say about its increasing prevalence in our day. I continue to root for pluralism, even though I've only barely hinted here today at a kind of dispositional pluralism, for it to meet the challenge of the disaffected. Here I do think especially of the witness of the church, and maybe this can be part of our conversation later. There are few places where the tension between diversity and solidarity is felt more acutely, yet the church is clearly called to seek an earthly approximation of peoples from every nation gathered together. This poses its own challenge when we consider that seeking that vision can itself lead people to break away and hunker down in self-isolation. But the calling persists. One of the church's difficult tasks is cultivating dispositions that include those people too. Thank you.
So we now have about 25 minutes for discussion. I remind you of just a couple of ground rules. We'd like to privilege student questions first and foremost. Secondly, if you have a question, please keep it brief and make it clear to whom you are addressing your question, please. So the floor is open.
Not a student, apologies to students, but Mike handed me the microphone. Thanks for the panel. I wanted to address my question to Professor Johnson. I appreciated the questions that you were asking. I thought they were very, very good. I wanted to push you maybe a step further to reflect on the practice, right? You were talking about practices. And so I would like to ask how you talk about or teach practices for church communities beyond, obviously, liturgical worship, right? Worship is the center of it, but other practices within the church that could help form these virtues. Within that, one specific I might ask is how do you think about or talk about catechesis, right? How are we shaping children for the next generation? Thank you.
Yes, thanks for the question. So, I mean, you're catching me in a time where I'm questioning some of what I have been teaching. So I thought this might be a good, fruitful opportunity to think together about some of this. So I teach that worship is central and the most formative practice, and that the other sort of practices, disciplines we might do, from scripture reading and prayer to hospitality, flow from that, and sort of flow back into that. And I teach a lot of the importance of being theologically aware and culturally aware. So we have, I think, a lot of Christians very interested in what it takes to live faithfully, and a lot of pastors sort of pulling their hair out, trying to figure out what's going on. But I'm not sure we've been as attentive to some of the shaping cultural and political realities as we need to be. So part of it is, in this class I teach on the practice of discipleship, which is a required course. A huge chunk is on theology and a huge chunk is on culture, and I don't think students would have expected that when they walked in the door. And then we move towards practices, because my concern is if you just begin with practices, you can put them right into whatever problematic framework you might have. And the practices themselves, I don't think, are shaping us. It's the Trinity at work through the practices, and it's a lot of discernment that I'm not sure we've always had within our church leadership. So part is aware. My hopefulness is that awareness. So, for example, if we spent a day trying to explore what was going on with the kneeling for the flag controversy and placing that within a framework of civil religion and the collapse of the sacred canopy, and trying to give these categories to make sense of when someone in your ministry is vehemently angry about the flag, they may not even know why. And here's some categories to try to make sense of that. I feel like I'm talking for a while. So I didn't really get to the children part, but maybe we can talk after about sort of catechesis. I do a lot with catechesis, and we look at the early church and the 3 years of formation that was taken to invite people into a whole different way of life. And we also look at the history of the Sunday school movement, that these inherited institutions don't have to be that way, and that we could reimagine, and that this is a moment for reimagining.
This is, I guess, for Professor Riddle, and I'm asking this question out of ignorance, and I'm not an expert on India, obviously. It seems like your claim is that on balance, the people in the region you were studying experience liberalism, though a mixed bag, as positive. It's on balance good for them. But it seems like there's also another tradition in Indian political thought that says liberalism is a colonial imposition. And I'm thinking of Gandhi's work, his focus on, say, the spinning wheel as this emblem of freedom for the Indian household against the market, the colonial market. Or more recently, people like Vandana Shiva, who have argued that the liberal economy comes in and disempowers local people and takes people who are in marginal, precarious situations already and actually makes it worse for them and is exacerbating this epidemic of farmer suicides and disempowering women. So I guess, could you speak to, are you saying that liberalism is on balance good for these different communities in India? And what about the sort of counter-tradition?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think my main argument was we maybe shouldn't say liberalism has failed because it is good and bad in a lot of settings, and we need to be really aware of context and diversity within those contexts. So you're really helpfully pointing to different experiences with liberalism within India that maybe counter some of my stories. I worry about the universalizing tendencies of liberalism, and so I really worry about my own universalizing tendencies. So I certainly don't want to make claims about all of India or all of Indian women or anything like that when I share some of the stories that I learned when I was doing my field research. So really all that I can say is that the aspect of liberalism that the marginalized women that I was researching with, that they really grabbed onto and seemed to value, was the human rights framework and the insistence that every individual has dignity and every individual needs to be free from abuse and from violence and things like that. And I think it's very difficult to make that claim if you have a totally communal sort of mindset without also recognizing the fact that individuals are distinct from one another. Even with that said, a lot of these women did really value their membership in these ethnic groups, and they didn't want to give that up. But at the same time, they also wanted to hold on to human rights. And also, I think the market experiences that I was describing of these women were much more sort of localized. I mean, these women were growing vegetables in their backyard and bringing them to Ima Market, and that's pretty different from sort of participation in global capitalism, right? So maybe that is pushing more closely towards what Professor Deneen thinks about in terms of, sort of going to local communities and being self-sufficient. But they were sufficient much beyond their own households and still needing to participate in exchange with others, at least on the city level, I would say. So I don't know if that's a complete answer to your question, but just to say that there were some aspects of liberalism that they found to be very important and very effective, particularly when it comes to pushing back against violence and abuse of women.
This question is directed at Dr. Dendulk or Dr. Johnson. What sort of resources and or practices would you point at to, within the Christian tradition, to help deal with this social isolation and loneliness that was discussed, and is such a problem both within and outside of the church?
Sure, I can start. Although you recall I did say that I was copping out, so just asking questions. I mean, one way I suppose to address that question is to ask, well, if people are suffering from social isolation, how do we become more hospitable so that they will be members of groups, right? So in other words, a set of dispositions that are enfolding of people who are sensing this level of social isolation in their lives. That's why, incidentally, I used Kamek's example, because he is focusing especially on this disposition of hospitality. And so that has this connotation, of course, of an openness and an invitation to be a part of community. And so the idea here is not so much to say that we have to invent new dispositions, but that we have to reorient dispositions that we are already aware of and that we might even think of as being part of faithful discipleship, but to refocus them on people who may be disaffected from groups in the first place. So I'd point to something like hospitality. I've been thinking a bit lately in a different context about this contrast between acts of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians. And it's sort of interesting to think about it because the acts of the flesh, one of the references there, I mean, most of those acts of the flesh focus in some way on discord, on faction. In fact, that word shows up, faction, in most translations of that passage. And of course, for those of us attuned to constitutional history in this country, immediately think, oh, well, that's kind of an interesting connection, that in some ways factions become institutionalized through constitutional means in the U.S., but we're, as Christians, in that passage, confronted with the idea that, in fact, we have a contrasting set of dispositions in the fruit of the Spirit, of forbearance and the like. So I've also been thinking about those kinds of dispositions and how they might apply in the context of social isolation. But I guess my overall point is that the wheel doesn't need to be reinvented, just reoriented.
I still feel hopeful that if we could immerse ourselves in our own tradition and also in some of the global Christian voices, that can help shape our categories and our thinking. So I'm in my earliest work having a huge chunk of my life immersed in Augustine of Hippo and seeing how differently he thought about the human person, and that you couldn't imagine, seeking the good without others. I mean, that was part of what it meant to be a human, and to seek the greatest good was to seek God, and God in relation to others, and what that might offer to our frameworks. And if you look at global Christians who come from different settings and haven't inherited some of our individualistic mindsets, I think we can equally reap some of those resources. I still like to think the biblical story itself is very formative, and that if we can, again, retell that as this very communal story. I know for some of my students, it's, we meet together because it helps us. It's sort of a pragmatic, why do we gather together, rather than what if this is at the very heart of God's purposes, was to create a people and gather a people. I am your God, you are my people. And then that's what we are in Christ, as a people, and how might we inhabit that. The other thing I wanted to mention is my good German friend, Gisela Kreglinger. She spent some time teaching at a seminary in the South, having lived in multiple places, but she would push her students who really wanted, she was teaching on spiritual formation and practices, they always wanted to focus on, sort of the individual quiet time and the prayer time, and she would say, honestly, what you most need is hospitality. You need to recover the practice of hospitality. That's what this moment in the church most needs. And she practices daily prayer and Bible reading, but she's saying what I see as I look at this landscape is the need for embodied hospitality. And also her more recent work is on the spirituality of wine, and it's a very beautiful sense of being connected to God's creation through things like wine and food and community, and that I think all would be very formative practices if we could be intentional about them.
Is there anyone else? I see a hand over here.
This is a question for Professor Plantinga. No, I'm kidding. For Dr. Johnson. One thing that's not been commented on, I think, the last 2 days is the fact that Deneen is a Catholic social theorist. I wonder if part of the problem isn't that liberalism itself is kind of an outgrowth of Protestantism. It's not Catholic social thinking, it's Protestant social thinking. And that comes out in certain ways in the way we view the church. Right? I mean, Catholics don't view the church as a voluntary association. So if you think about the medieval world and the things that checked the growth of the secular order of the secular state, is the fact that the church was a non-voluntary association that wielded political power in its own right and provided an institutional make-weight to the other forms of authority that were forming, Whereas in the advent of the liberal state, I mean, it's a state, right? It's absorptive. It takes on the authority and the functions of other sorts of social institutions. And thinking of the church as a voluntary association is already a kind of weakening of these institutional make-weights that could check the power of the state. And I think part of what Patrick is, I'm not sure that book could have been written if you were a Protestant. I think it would have been written quite differently. So I'm wondering if you can comment on this idea that maybe the issues we have with liberalism tend to just be Protestant and Catholic issues.
I'm thinking about one of the theologians who shaped my thinking about how we could reimagine public and re-expand, reinvigorate our notion of public so it's not just private or political, but that we could really have a more robust space for entities like churches to really live out their faith. Was Reinhard Hooter at Duke Divinity, and he had sort of this beautiful picture of the church and the public, and then shortly after I learned of him and his powerful work, he became Catholic, and I thought, oh, there's got to be a Protestant way to do this. So I don't know that I have the answer by any means, but I do recognize the challenge that I think those who are sort of drawn to reimagine or reconceptualize how the church could really be lived out and embodied do often seem to end up in Rome. So what resources do we have? I think they're there, but again, that's where I worry about sort of we've been so shaped for so long in certain ways of imagining how these entities fit together that it's harder to find them. And yeah, I know we heard last night about, there's the Catholic tradition also of trying to sort of fit within to contemporary American categories, and I respect the Dutch neo-Calvinist tradition of trying to imagine this different way through principled pluralism. I haven't yet found myself able to fully buy into that way of getting at it. So I don't have a lot more than that at this point. Maybe we can continue the conversation over lunch. Any of you?
There's one here, Micah as well, closer to you, perhaps.
On my mind is President George H.W. Bush's funeral this past week. I don't know if any of you had an opportunity to watch any of that. And if you did, I'd be kind of curious your reflections on that as we've been talking in this panel yesterday and again today about, especially in the context of pluralism. I saw kind of unfolded on the stage there a lot of, he's Episcopal, of course, and so one of these mainline that was mentioned, that was kind of been enfolded, it was mentioned even yesterday, how liberalism today has kind of enfolded a lot of mainline Christianity, and how the two are kind of have become almost kind of seamless. And it seemed like you saw some of that for those of you who watched that. You saw expressions of the Christian faith, but then you also heard the Episcopal priests talk very pluralistically about imams and rabbis, and so it was this kind of strange juxtaposition between an overt Christian proclamation, but also at the same time an affirmation of a healthy pluralism, and that we all serve one God. And I'm wondering how is that an expression, the liberalism that we have that emphasizes the individual, is that also emphasizing pluralism at the same time? They almost seem like they would be opposite, but culturally I almost hear both of these same things coexisting equally and being promoted equally.
No.
So nobody saw the funeral apparently, so nobody can comment.
Yeah. Right.
We have time for maybe one quick question.
Yeah, there was a hand here.
Where was that? Where is that?
Were you directing that to a specific participant? This is for whoever would like to take it. All right. Anybody?
You're going to be much better.
I can begin. Hopefully that will give you time to think of things. I mean, I do sometimes when I'm speaking to Christians about political engagement suggest that part of our recent history has been thinking politics is the way to change things and investing incredible amounts of money and time and energy into thinking that's going to be the way and suggesting that arts and culture and other means might be as or perhaps even more formative. Now, I know there's discussion, does law follow culture? Can culture be shaped by laws? And I think we can find examples both ways. But the Billy Elliot effect, I think, is quite powerful. If you remember the film Billy Elliot, about sort of a working-class British boy who becomes this ballet dancer. And I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but the data shows that within a year, I mean, the number of boys who began trying out for ballet programs in Britain was out, exponentially more. Similar after The Martian came out, I didn't see it, Matt Damon movie, then the rise in applications for astronauts, sort of went out. So there are these senses in which popular culture is more formative than maybe sometimes academics agree, although there's thriving conversations among Christians around the arts and their importance. But trying to cast that vision and sort of get that onto the ground and then say, you have to do a lot of hard work to think through your vision of humanity and goodness and, and let that shape the art that you offer. So then you get into, does it need to be Christian art or art shaped by our faith, and what does that look like to offer that to the world? Similar to what came up yesterday about what does it look like to create video games rooted in faith that offer pictures of good life, but don't necessarily have to be Christian. That's one of the important conversations happening right now.
Just one thing to add. If our media consumption has been in some ways colonized by our political preferences, it might seem then that, and that's sort of created greater problems with polarization as a result. We're consuming media that reinforces these kinds of commitments that divide us in the first place. It might seem that the response then is to broaden out our consumption patterns, right? So, people say, well, take a look at your Twitter feed. Who's on Twitter? Should you be following folks that you disagree with? And one caution about that is really in the presentation that I was making is that there's a fair bit of study on this, and the fact that even the broadening out or the diversifying of media consumption can actually itself be alienating, right, or paralyzing, right? So now I have all of these different messages that I'm consuming, and I don't know what to do with that level of complexity, moral or otherwise. And so it calls for a different way of thinking about how we consume media, and a much more, you referred to it as hard work, right? That it has to be much more intentional. It has to be in the context of community and conversation over what you're consuming, rather this kind of individualistic experience of diverse messages.
I just had one quick story. 3 or 4 years ago, Minecraft was pretty new, and my son, who was, I don't know, maybe 5-ish, we did let him play. And we were walking down the sidewalk one night, and he says, Mom, did Christians create Minecraft? I don't think so. Why? And he said, it's so beautiful. I feel like Christians should have made it. It's like, oh, I hope you can hold on to that belief that Christians make the most beautiful things.
Yeah,
but, I don't know how often that really happens, but that's like, wouldn't it be great if that was our reputation for offering beauty and goodness to the world?
That sounds like a really appropriate note on which to end. So let's thank our panelists one last time.